The moving truck pulled away from the beautiful two-story house on 247 Oak Lane, leaving the Johnson family standing proudly on their new driveway. Marcus Johnson, a tall man in his early 40s with kind eyes and graying temples, wrapped his arm around his wife Sarah's shoulders as they looked at their dream home. After 15 years of hard work as a cardiothoracic surgeon, he had finally given his family the home they deserved. "Well, what do you think?" Marcus asked, watching his children, 12-year-old Michael and 9-year-old Ashley, already racing around the spacious front yard. The late summer breeze rustled through the mature oak trees that lined their street in the upscale Riverside Heights neighborhood. Sarah leaned into her husband's embrace, her dark curls catching the afternoon sunlight. "It's perfect, Marcus. Just perfect." Her eyes lingered on the large backyard, already imagining the family gatherings they could host there. As they began unpacking boxes in the kitchen, the doorbell rang. Marcus opened the front door to find an elderly couple standing there with a homemade apple pie. They introduced themselves as the Wilsons from across the street. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Mrs. Wilson said warmly, though Marcus noticed Mr. Wilson's slight hesitation when they shook hands. The Johnsons were one of the few black families in this predominantly white suburban area, but Marcus had dealt with these subtle reactions throughout his medical career. Over the next few days, more neighbors stopped by with welcome gifts and polite conversation. Everyone seemed friendly enough, except for their next-door neighbor on the right. Marcus had noticed the man watching them through his windows, but had yet to meet him face to face. "That's Harold Patterson," informed Linda Thompson, another neighbor who had brought over a basket of muffins. "He keeps to himself mostly, especially since his wife passed away 5 years ago. Don't take it personally." By the end of their first week, the Johnsons had settled into a routine. Michael and Ashley started at their new schools, Sarah began organizing her home office for her remote marketing job, and Marcus adjusted to the shorter commute to the city hospital. On Saturday morning, Marcus stood in his new backyard, carefully assembling his prized possession, a large, professional-grade BBQ grill that had been passed down from his father. The grill had been the centerpiece of countless family gatherings over the years, and tomorrow would be their first Sunday BBQ in their new home. As Marcus worked, he felt eyes on him. Looking up, he caught a glimpse of Harold Patterson quickly stepping away from his window. The man appeared to be in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and a permanent frown etched on his face. Sarah came out with a glass of lemonade for Marcus. "Still haven't met the mysterious Mr. Patterson?" she asked, following his gaze to the neighbor's house. Marcus shook his head. "Not yet, but tomorrow's BBQ might bring him out. Dad always said good food has a way of bringing people together." That evening, Marcus sent out invitations to their immediate neighbors for Sunday lunch. He remembered his father's words about the importance of building community, especially in a new neighborhood. "Son," his father had told him, "our Sunday BBQs aren't just about the food. They're about bringing people together, breaking bread, and breaking down walls." As Marcus stood in his kitchen preparing his special dry rub for the ribs, he watched through the window as Harold Patterson picked up the invitation from his doorstep. The older man read it, his expression unreadable, then disappeared inside his house with the card. Sarah hugged Marcus from behind. "You really think he'll come?" "I don't know," Marcus replied honestly, "but everyone deserves a chance to be a good neighbor." That night, as the Johnson family sat around their half-unpacked dining room, excited chatter filled the air about tomorrow's BBQ. Michael and Ashley argued good-naturedly about which of their grandfather's famous recipes was the best, while Sarah finished her homemade coleslaw. Little did they know that next door, Harold Patterson sat alone in his dimly lit living room, their invitation sitting on his coffee table, as memories of past Sunday gatherings with his late wife Mary swirled in his mind, along with other, darker thoughts that would soon surface. Sunday morning arrived with perfect weather for a BBQ. Marcus woke up early, just as the sun was beginning to paint the sky in soft orange hues. He had always been his father's helper during their family BBQs, and now it was his turn to carry on the tradition. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen as he began his preparations. By 9 a.m., Marcus had his grill fired up. The special blend of oak and hickory wood chips that his father had sworn by started releasing their sweet smoke into the air. In the kitchen, Sarah and the kids were busy preparing sides. Potato salad, cornbread, and baked beans, all family recipes passed down through generations. "Daddy, can I help with the ribs?" Ashley asked, bouncing on her toes next to the grill. Marcus smiled, remembering how he used to do the same with his father. Sure, sweetheart. Remember what Grandpa always said about the secret to perfect ribs? Marcus asked, holding up the seasoning mix. Love is the secret ingredient. Both Ashley and Michael shouted together, making Sarah laugh from the patio where she was setting up tables. Around 11:30 a.m., the first guests began to arrive. The Wilsons came first, bringing their famous apple pie. Mrs. Wilson immediately offered to help Sarah in the kitchen, while Mr. Wilson stood by the grill, clearly impressed by Marcus's setup. That's quite a serious piece of equipment you got there, Mr. Wilson said, his initial hesitation from their first meeting noticeably reduced as he watched Marcus expertly handle the grill. More neighbors arrived, the Thompsons with their teenage sons, the Garcias from 2 doors down, and even the elderly Mrs. Chen from across the street brought her homemade spring rolls. The backyard slowly filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter. Marcus kept glancing at Harold Patterson's house. The curtains would occasionally move, but their mysterious neighbor hadn't appeared. Sarah had purposely set up a place for him at one of the tables, hoping he might join them. As the afternoon progressed, the atmosphere grew more relaxed. The kids played tag in the yard while the adults chatted and enjoyed the food. Marcus noticed how Michael and Ashley were already making friends with the neighborhood children, their laughter filling the air. Dr. Johnson, these ribs are incredible, Linda Thompson said, reaching for another piece. You'll have to share your secret. Marcus smiled, thinking of his father. Family secret, passed down from my dad. He always said good food brings good people together. The conversation flowed easily among the neighbors. They learned that the Garcias owned a local restaurant. Mrs. Chen had been a professor of mathematics before retiring, and the Wilsons had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years. Just as Marcus was about to serve the second batch of ribs, a movement caught his eye. Harold Patterson had finally emerged from his house and was standing at the edge of his property, watching the gathering. He held what appeared to be a folder in his hands. Sarah noticed too and waved warmly. Mr. Patterson, please join us. We have plenty of food. The old man's face darkened at the invitation. Instead of responding, he turned and walked back into his house, closing the door firmly behind him. A subtle tension fell over the gathering, but Marcus quickly lifted the mood by announcing that dessert was ready. As the afternoon turned to evening, the party began to wind down. The neighbors helped clean up, expressing their thanks and commenting on what a wonderful tradition the Sunday BBQ was. Several asked if this would be a regular event. Every Sunday, weather permitting, Marcus confirmed. It's a family tradition we plan to keep alive. After the last guest left, the Johnson family sat on their patio in the growing darkness. The kids were tired but happy, and Sarah leaned against Marcus's shoulder contentedly. That went well, she said softly, though I wish Mr. Patterson had joined us. Marcus nodded, looking at the dark windows of their neighbor's house. Give it time. Dad always said the best recipes need time to develop their flavor. Maybe it's the same with neighbors. What they didn't know was that Harold Patterson was sitting in his darkened living room, looking through old documents and regulations about neighborhood noise and smoke ordinances, his mind filling with plans that would soon disrupt their peaceful Sunday tradition. The third Sunday arrived with the same pleasant weather as before. The Johnson family had fallen into their comfortable routine of BBQ preparations. This time, even more neighbors had asked to join, having heard about the delicious food and friendly atmosphere from others. Marcus was at his grill by mid-morning, teaching Michael how to check if the meat was done properly. See, son? When you press it gently, it should feel like this, he demonstrated, just as his father had taught him years ago. Sarah and Ashley were setting up the tables when they heard heavy footsteps approaching. Harold Patterson was marching across his lawn toward them, his face red with anger. He clutched a thick folder in one hand and a noise meter in the other. This stops today, Harold shouted, causing Ashley to jump and move behind her mother. Marcus straightened up from the grill, wiping his hands on his apron. Mr. Patterson, Marcus said calmly, is everything all right? Harold thrust a stack of papers toward Marcus. These are the local ordinances about noise pollution and smoke nuisance. You people have been violating them for 3 weeks now. The way he said you people made Sarah's face tighten. She guided Ashley inside, but Michael stood his ground next to his father. Mr. Patterson, Marcus tried again, keeping his voice steady. I'd be happy to discuss any concerns you have. Would you like to join us for lunch? we can talk about. Join you. Harold interrupted, his voice getting louder. Do you think I want to be part of your disruption of our peaceful neighborhood? The smoke from your grill is damaging my property. The noise from your gatherings is disturbing my peace. By now, several early arriving neighbors had witnessed the scene. Mrs. Wilson stepped forward. Harold, that's enough. The Johnsons are lovely people, and their BBQs have brought our neighborhood together. Brought together, they're bringing down our property values. Harold snapped. He waved the noise meter in the air. I've been measuring the decibel levels. Every Sunday, it's the same thing. Noise, smoke, cars blocking the street. Marcus noticed his son's hands were clenched into fists. He placed a gentle hand on Michael's shoulder, remembering his own father's lessons about handling difficult situations with dignity. Mr. Patterson, Marcus said firmly but politely, I understand you have concerns. We can discuss proper smoke ventilation, and I'm happy to adjust our speaker volume. But I'd appreciate it if you'd express your concerns more respectfully, especially in front of my children. Harold's face grew even redder. Don't tell me about respect. I've lived here for 30 years. This was a quiet, respectable neighborhood until... Until what, Mr. Patterson? Linda Thompson interrupted, stepping forward. Other neighbors had gathered now, forming a supportive circle around the Johnsons. Harold looked around, suddenly aware of his audience. But instead of backing down, he raised his chin defiantly. I'm calling the authorities. This is a residential area, not a restaurant. And I'll be filing a formal complaint with the HOA first thing tomorrow. As he turned to storm off, he bumped into the table, knocking over a pitcher of lemonade. The yellow liquid splashed across his shoes, making him even angrier. Now look what you made me do, he shouted, backing away. You'll be hearing from my lawyer about this too. The neighbors watched in shocked silence as Harold limped back to his house, slamming his door so hard that the windows rattled. Sarah came back outside, hugging Ashley, who was crying softly. Maybe we should stop the BBQs, she suggested quietly to Marcus. No way, Michael protested. We can't let him win, Dad. Grandpa wouldn't stop just because someone was being mean. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, patting Michael's shoulder. The boy is right. My family faced similar treatment when we first moved here 20 years ago. Harold will learn, just as others did. Marcus looked at his family, then at his neighbors who had stood by them. The BBQ continues, he announced. Everyone's welcome, including Mr. Patterson, if he changes his mind. But as they returned to their preparations, they all knew that this was just the beginning. Through his window, they could see Harold Patterson on his phone, gesturing angrily. The coming week would bring challenges none of them expected. The following week turned into a nightmare for the Johnson family. True to his word, Harold Patterson launched a full-scale campaign against them. It started Monday morning when 2 police officers showed up at their door during breakfast. We've received multiple complaints about noise and smoke violations, the younger officer explained, looking uncomfortable as he pulled out his notebook. Marcus invited them in and calmly showed them their grill's safety certificates and local permits he'd already obtained. The officers left satisfied that that was just the beginning. By Tuesday afternoon, Harold had filed 3 separate complaints with the Homeowners Association. He claimed the Johnsons' weekly gatherings were destroying the peaceful character of the neighborhood and creating unsafe conditions. Sarah found Ashley crying in her room after school on Wednesday. Jenny said she can't come to our house anymore, Ashley sobbed. Her mom heard Mr. Patterson saying our BBQs might make people sick. Marcus held a family meeting that evening in their living room. We need to decide this together, he said, looking at each family member. These BBQs are our tradition, but not if it's hurting our family. Michael, who had been quiet all week, spoke up. Dad, remember what Grandpa used to say about people who tried to stop his BBQs back in the day? He said good food and kindness eventually win over hate. Thursday brought more trouble. Harold had somehow gathered signatures from a few neighbors who lived on the other side of the neighborhood. Their petition demanded the HOA ban excessive outdoor cooking activities and large regular gatherings without special permits. Linda Thompson dropped by that evening to warn them. Harold's been going door to door, telling people your BBQ smoke contains dangerous chemicals that will hurt their children. He's even claiming it will lower property values by 20%. Marcus and Sarah stayed up late discussing their options. Through their bedroom window, they could see Harold's house, his kitchen light on as he presumably planned his next move. Maybe we could invite him over without the BBQ, Sarah suggested. Just talk to him, try to understand why he's so angry. Before Marcus could respond, their phones buzzed with an email from the HOA. An emergency meeting had been called for Friday evening to discuss the ongoing situation at 247 Oak Lane. The meeting room at the community center was packed that Friday. Harold sat in the front row, his folder of complaints ready. The Johnsons entered to find most of their immediate neighbors had saved them seats in the middle section. Harold spoke first, standing with his papers shaking in his hands. These people, he began, pointing at the Johnsons, think they can turn our quiet street into a commercial zone. Every Sunday, smoke fills our air, noise disturbs our peace, and strangers invade our neighborhood. Several people shifted uncomfortably at his choice of words. Mrs. Chen stood up without waiting to be called. Harold Patterson, you should be ashamed. When my late husband and I moved here. But before she could finish, another neighbor stood up, Janet Rivera, who lived 3 houses down. She turned to face the crowd, her expression serious. Wait, she said loudly. Dr. Johnson, Marcus Johnson, from City General Hospital? Marcus nodded, confused by the interruption. Janet's eyes filled with tears. You're the surgeon who operated on my Robert last year. The emergency valve replacement, Christmas Eve. You saved his life. The room fell silent. Harold's face paled slightly as he watched Janet walk over to hug Marcus. My husband had less than an hour to live, Janet continued, now addressing the whole room. Dr. Johnson canceled his holiday plans and stayed with us all night, and now you're complaining about him having family BBQs. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Harold stood frozen, his papers forgotten in his hands, as more neighbors began sharing stories about Marcus's work at the hospital. But just as the tide seemed to turn in the Johnsons' favor, Harold dropped his papers and rushed out of the meeting room. The look on his face wasn't just anger anymore. There was something else there, something that hinted at a deeper pain no one had noticed before. After Harold's sudden exit from the HOA meeting, people lingered in small groups, talking in hushed voices. Linda Thompson approached Marcus and Sarah with a troubled look on her face. There's something you need to know about Harold, she said softly. I've lived here for 20 years, and I'd never told anyone this, but given what happened tonight. Marcus and Sarah listened as Linda told them about Harold's past. 5 years ago, Harold's wife, Mary, had gone into the hospital for what should have been a routine heart procedure. There were complications during surgery, and she never made it home. He filed a discrimination lawsuit against City General, Linda explained. He claimed they gave her a less experienced surgeon because of their race and age. The hospital proved the surgeon was highly qualified, but Harold never accepted it. He sold his medical practice after that. Medical practice? Sarah asked, surprised. Harold was a family doctor for 30 years, Linda nodded. After losing Mary in the lawsuit, he just changed, became bitter, suspicious of everyone, especially doctors. Marcus sat down heavily in a nearby chair. I remember that case, he said quietly. I wasn't involved, but it was a big deal at the hospital. I never made the connection. That weekend, for the first time in 3 generations, the Johnson family didn't have their Sunday BBQ. Instead, Marcus spent hours in his study, reviewing the old hospital records he had access to. Dad. Michael knocked on the study door Sunday afternoon. Are we ever going to have BBQs again? Marcus looked up from his computer, seeing not just his son but his father's legacy in question. Sometimes, son, healing takes more than good food. We're not giving up. Monday morning, Marcus did something unexpected. He called in to take a day off from work, something he rarely did. After the kids left for school, he walked next door and knocked on Harold's door. It took several minutes before Harold opened the door, looking suspicious. What do you want? To talk about Mary, Marcus said gently. Harold's face went through several emotions: shock, anger, pain. You have no right. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon at City General, Marcus continued calmly. I've reviewed Mary's case. You were right about some things, Harold. There were protocols that weren't followed properly that day. Harold's hands gripped the doorframe tightly. What did you say? The hospital won the lawsuit because the surgeon was qualified, but you were right that things could have been handled better. The emergency response time was slower than it should have been. The communication with your family was poor. Tears formed in Harold's eyes. For the first time, Marcus saw past the angry neighbor to the grieving husband. "Would you like to come in?" Harold asked, his voice barely a whisper. Inside Harold's house, Marcus saw what everyone had missed. Photos of Mary were everywhere. Her garden tools still hung by the back door, overlooking the Johnsons' yard where the BBQs were held. She loved cooking out, Harold said, following Marcus's gaze. Every Sunday she'd make her special cornbread, the smell of BBQs, the sound of people laughing. "It just brings it all back," Marcus finished softly. They talked for hours. Harold shared stories about Mary, about their life together, about the anger that had consumed him after her loss. Marcus listened, sharing his own experiences of losing patients, of the weight doctors carry. "I became a surgeon because my father had heart problems," Marcus explained. "He survived, thank God, but it made me want to help others. That's also why we do the BBQs, his way of celebrating life every week." Harold wiped his eyes with a tissue. "Mary would have loved your BBQs," he said finally. "She would have been first in line with her cornbread, probably telling me to stop being such a grump." As Marcus left Harold's house that evening, something had shifted. The wall between them hadn't completely fallen, but there were cracks in it now, cracks through which understanding could grow. Walking home, Marcus smiled, hearing his father's voice in his head. "Sometimes, son, the best seasoning is time and truth." The next few days brought subtle changes to Oak Lane. Neighbors noticed Harold Patterson spending more time in his front yard, tending to the flower beds that had been Mary's pride and joy. He no longer glared at children who passed by, and even managed a slight nod when Sarah waved to him on her way to work. On Thursday afternoon, Marcus was surprised to find a dusty box on his front porch with a note from Harold. "Found these while cleaning. Thought you might want to see them." Inside were old medical journals from Harold's days as a family doctor, including several articles he had published about patient care and communication. Marcus spent that evening reading through Harold's work. "Sarah, look at this," he called to his wife. He was a pioneer in patient advocacy back in the 80s. He wrote about the importance of doctors treating the whole person, not just the illness. Sarah read over his shoulder. "Sounds like someone else I know," she smiled, squeezing her husband's shoulder. The next day, Marcus took a bold step. He knocked on Harold's door again, journals in hand. This time, Harold opened the door more quickly. "These articles are incredible," Marcus said sincerely. "We still teach some of these principles to medical students. Would you consider coming to speak to my residents about patient care?" Harold's eyes widened in surprise. I haven't practiced in years," he stammered. "But your experience is valuable," Marcus pressed gently, "especially your perspective as both a doctor and a patient's family member." Harold stood silent for a long moment, then surprised Marcus by chuckling softly. "Mary always said I'd go back to teaching someday. She said I was too good at lecturing to waste it just yelling at the TV." As they talked about medicine, Harold gradually opened up more about Mary. He showed Marcus the kitchen where she had perfected her cornbread recipe, the garden where she spent countless hours, and finally, the photo albums he kept in his study. "This was our first house," Harold pointed to a faded photograph. "We were so young, just starting out. Every Sunday, we'd invite the whole neighborhood over. Mary said good food was the best medicine for loneliness." Marcus listened, seeing his own family's tradition reflected in Harold's memories. "You know," he said carefully, "we haven't had a BBQ for 2 weeks now. The kids miss it, and so do the neighbors." Harold's face clouded briefly, but then he looked at the photo of Mary again. "She would be so ashamed of how I've acted," he said quietly. "All these years, I've been dishonoring her memory by pushing people away." "It's never too late to change," Marcus replied. "My father used to say that." Later that evening, the Johnson family was surprised by another delivery from Harold. A recipe card, yellow with age, for Mary's famous Southern cornbread. The note attached read, "Mary would want this tradition to continue." Sarah found Marcus staring at the recipe card long after the kids had gone to bed. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "About how pain can make us forget who we are," he replied. Harold was a healer too. before grief turned him into something else. And now? Sarah prompted. Marcus smiled. Now maybe it's time for some healing of our own. He picked up his phone and began typing a message to the neighborhood group chat. Sunday BBQ is back this week, special guest and special cornbread included. That night, two houses sat quiet under the stars, the Johnsons and Harolds. In one, a family slept peacefully, their tradition ready to be renewed. In the other, an old man stood at his window, looking at his wife's garden and, for the first time in years, allowing himself to remember the joy their Sunday gatherings had brought, not just the pain of their ending. On his bedside table lay another message from Marcus. The residents would love to hear your lecture next week, but first, we need your expert opinion on the proper way to serve cornbread at a BBQ. Sunday morning arrived with a mix of excitement and nervousness in both the Johnson and Patterson households. Harold woke up early, something he hadn't done in years. He stood in his kitchen, carefully measuring ingredients for Mary's cornbread recipe, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. Across the yard, Marcus was preparing his grill while Michael and Ashley helped Sarah set up tables. The kids kept glancing at Harold's house, still unsure about the man who had caused their family so much trouble. Do you think he'll really come, Dad? Michael asked, carrying a stack of plates. Sometimes people surprise us, Marcus replied, remembering his father's wisdom. Everyone deserves a second chance. At exactly 11:30 a.m., Harold emerged from his house. He carried a covered dish, walking slowly toward the Johnsons' yard. The neighbors who had already arrived fell silent, watching this unexpected development. Mrs. Chen broke the tension by walking straight up to Harold. Is that Mary's cornbread? I remember it from the church potluck 15 years ago. Nobody could ever match her recipe. Harold's eyes moistened. You remember that? Of course. Mary gave me the recipe, but it never turned out the same. She said it was because I didn't add enough love to the batter. Mrs. Chen's kind words brought a small smile to Harold's face. Marcus approached them, wiping his hands on his apron. Mr. Patterson, would you like to help me at the grill? My father always said BBQ is better with two sets of hands. To everyone's surprise, Harold nodded. Soon, he was standing beside Marcus, sharing stories about the medical profession and his own experiences with Sunday gatherings. The other neighbors listened, fascinated by this new side of the man they'd known only as the neighborhood grouch. You know, Harold said quietly to Marcus, I used to grill too. Mary loved having people over. After I lost her, the sound of other people's happiness became painful. I forgot that she would have wanted the traditions to continue. Ashley approached them cautiously, holding a glass of lemonade. Mr. Patterson, would you like a drink? Mom says it's important to stay hydrated when you're by the grill. Harold accepted the glass, his hand trembling slightly. Thank you, young lady. Your mother is very wise. He paused, then added, I'm sorry I scared you before. That wasn't right of me. The afternoon progressed, and something remarkable happened. Harold's presence didn't dampen the festivities. It enhanced them. He shared stories about the neighborhood's history, about Mary's famous garden parties, and about his years as a doctor. During lunch, Harold stood up unexpectedly, tapping his glass for attention. The crowd fell silent, some worried about what he might say. I owe everyone an apology, he began, his voice rough with emotion, especially the Johnson family. Grief made me forget who I was, who Mary and I were. We built our life on bringing people together, not pushing them away. He turned to Marcus. Your BBQs, they're not just about food. They're about community, about healing. Mary understood that. I forgot it for a while, but I'm starting to remember. Marcus stood and extended his hand to Harold. Instead of shaking it, Harold pulled him into a brief hug, surprising everyone, including himself. Sarah whispered to Linda Thompson, I never thought I'd see this day. Linda smiled knowingly. Sometimes the heart needs time to heal, and sometimes it needs a good kick in the pants from a neighbor with a BBQ grill. As the afternoon turned to evening, Harold helped clean up, insisting on staying until the last dish was washed. Before heading home, he turned to Marcus. Next Sunday, he said hesitantly, would it be all right if I brought Mary's potato salad recipe? She always said it paired well with BBQ. Marcus smiled warmly. We'd be honored. And maybe you could tell the kids some stories about your medical school days? Michael's been talking about becoming a doctor. That night, as both families retired to their homes, the air was filled with more than just the lingering scent of BBQ. It carried the promise of healing, of new friendships, and of traditions renewed and shared. 1 month later, Oak Lane had transformed into the friendly, welcoming neighborhood it was always meant to be. The Johnson family's BBQ tradition had not only survived but had grown stronger, enriched by Harold Patterson's unexpected participation and Mary's cherished recipes. On this particular Sunday, something special was happening. Harold stood in his kitchen, surrounded by medical students from City General Hospital. They had come early, before the BBQ, to learn about patient care from his years of experience. Remember, Harold told them, mixing Mary's cornbread batter, medicine isn't just about treating symptoms, it's about treating people. Sometimes healing happens over a shared meal just as much as it does in a hospital room. The students scribbled notes eagerly, watching as the former doctor demonstrated how cooking and caring went hand in hand. Through the window, they could see Marcus setting up his grill, and several asked Harold about the story they'd heard at the hospital. Yes, Harold admitted, his voice humble. I was the angry neighbor who tried to shut down these BBQs. But Dr. Johnson showed me that sometimes the best medicine is patience and understanding. Later that afternoon, the BBQ was in full swing. The yard was filled with not just neighbors, but medical students and hospital staff who had come to hear Harold speak. He had become something of a legend at City General, the angry neighbor turned patient advocate and medical mentor. Michael and Ashley ran through the crowd, helping serve food and drinks. They no longer saw Harold as the scary man next door, but as the kind uncle who always had stories and candies in his pockets. Uncle Harold, Ashley called out, can you tell the story about how you and Mrs. Patterson met in medical school? Harold's eyes twinkled. Well, Mary was actually my patient first. She came in with a broken arm from a skiing accident, and she told me my bedside manner needed work. The crowd laughed, and Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand, remembering how far they'd all come. Linda Thompson arrived with a special surprise. She had found an old photo album from neighborhood events 20 years ago. In it were pictures of Harold and Mary at their own backyard parties, looking young and happy. Look at this, Harold said softly, showing Marcus a photo. That grill you're using? It looks just like the one Mary and I had. We used to joke that it was our marriage counselor. Couldn't stay angry when there was good food cooking. The medical students gathered around, seeing their mentor in a new light. One of them asked, Dr. Patterson, what's the most important lesson you've learned from all this? Harold looked around the yard, at the Johnson family who had forgiven him, at the neighbors who had welcomed him back, at the young doctors eager to learn from his mistakes and wisdom. The most important medicine, he said slowly, isn't found in any hospital. It's found in community, in tradition, in the willingness to see past our pain to the humanity in others. As the sun began to set, Marcus called everyone together for a special announcement. Today marks 1 month since our BBQ tradition was renewed, he said. But it's also something else. Harold, would you like to tell them? Harold stood up, holding Mary's old recipe box. Today would have been Mary's birthday, he said, his voice strong and clear. And in her honor, I've decided to do something she always wanted. Starting next month, I'll be volunteering at City General's family clinic, teaching young doctors about patient care. The announcement was met with cheers and applause. Mrs. Chen wiped away tears, remembering the Mary she had known. The medical students looked excited about having Dr. Patterson at the hospital. Marcus raised his glass. To Mary, he said, whose recipes and spirit brought healing to our neighborhood. To Mary, everyone echoed. As the evening wrapped up, Harold helped the Johnsons clean up, just as he did every Sunday now. Looking at his own empty house, he made another decision. Marcus, he said, would it be okay if I turned Mary's garden into a community space? For the BBQs and gatherings? She would have wanted that. Father and son smiled at each other, knowing that sometimes the best endings are really new beginnings. 1 month later, Oak Lane had transformed into the friendly, welcoming neighborhood it was always meant to be. The Johnson family's BBQ tradition had not only survived but had grown stronger, enriched by Harold Patterson's unexpected participation and Mary's cherished recipes. On this particular Sunday, something special was happening. Harold stood in his kitchen, surrounded by medical students from City General Hospital. They had come early, before the BBQ, to learn about patient care from his years of experience. Remember, Harold told them, mixing Mary's cornbread batter, medicine isn't just about treating symptoms, it's about treating people. Sometimes healing happens over a shared meal just as much as it does in a hospital room. The students scribbled notes eagerly, watching as the former doctor demonstrated how cooking and caring went hand in hand. Through the window, they could see Marcus setting up his grill, and several asked Harold about the story they'd heard at the hospital. Yes, Harold admitted, his voice humble. I was the angry neighbor who tried to shut down these BBQs. But Dr. Johnson showed me that sometimes the best medicine is patience and understanding. Later that afternoon, the BBQ was in full swing. The yard was filled with not just neighbors, but medical students and hospital staff who had come to hear Harold speak. He had become something of a legend at City General, the angry neighbor turned patient advocate and medical mentor. Michael and Ashley ran through the crowd, helping serve food and drinks. They no longer saw Harold as the scary man next door, but as the kind uncle who always had stories and candies in his pockets. Uncle Harold, Ashley called out, can you tell the story about how you and Mrs. Patterson met in medical school? Harold's eyes twinkled. Well, Mary was actually my patient first. She came in with a broken arm from a skiing accident, and she told me my bedside manner needed work. The crowd laughed, and Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand, remembering how far they'd all come. Linda Thompson arrived with a special surprise. She had found an old photo album from neighborhood events 20 years ago. In it were pictures of Harold and Mary at their own backyard parties, looking young and happy. Look at this, Harold said softly, showing Marcus a photo. That grill you're using? It looks just like the one Mary and I had. We used to joke that it was our marriage counselor. Couldn't stay angry when there was good food cooking. The medical students gathered around, seeing their mentor in a new light. One of them asked, Dr. Patterson, what's the most important lesson you've learned from all this? Harold looked around the yard, at the Johnson family who had forgiven him, at the neighbors who had welcomed him back, at the young doctors eager to learn from his mistakes and wisdom. The most important medicine, he said slowly, isn't found in any hospital. It's found in community, in tradition, in the willingness to see past our pain to the humanity in others. As the sun began to set, Marcus called everyone together for a special announcement. Today marks 1 month since our BBQ tradition was renewed, he said. But it's also something else. Harold, would you like to tell them? Harold stood up, holding Mary's old recipe box. Today would have been Mary's birthday, he said, his voice strong and clear. And in her honor, I've decided to do something she always wanted. Starting next month, I'll be volunteering at City General's family clinic, teaching young doctors about patient care. The announcement was met with cheers and applause. Mrs. Chen wiped away tears, remembering the Mary she had known. The medical students looked excited about having Dr. Patterson at the hospital. Marcus raised his glass. To Mary, he said, whose recipes and spirit brought healing to our neighborhood. To Mary, everyone echoed. As the evening wrapped up, Harold helped the Johnsons clean up, just as he did every Sunday now. Looking at his own empty house, he made another decision. Marcus, he said, would it be okay if I turned Mary's garden into a community space? For the BBQs and gatherings, she would have wanted that. Father and son smiled at each other, knowing that sometimes the best endings are really new beginnings.